Welcome to another episode of Serial Streamers. Feels like it's been a long time since we've done this, and that's because it has. I've been working on another project, and that was launching season 3 of my second true crime podcast, which is called Dirty Money Moves, Women in White Collar Crime. If you are into scammy females, then this is your show. Check it out. It's on all podcast players. It's Dirty Money Moves, Women in White Collar Crime. And this season, we are diving into a real scammy McScammerson. That's all I can say. But yeah, so it's been a while. I've been working on that, but we are back with Serial Streamers. My goal is always to release about 2 of these episodes per month on my YouTube channel, as well as my podcast, Murderish. But sometimes, life gets in the way. But here we are. And if you're wondering who am I and what is Serial Streamers, well, I'm Jami Rice. I am a full-time true crime podcaster, content creator, mom of 3, brand new grandma, live in the Los Angeles area. And I have 2 true crime podcasts that are active right now. One of them is called Murderish. That one's been around for almost 8 years. There are just under 200 episodes that you can binge right now. And then I also have Dirty Money Moves, which I just explained earlier, which is about female scam artists, con artists, fraudsters, white collar crime committers. And it's a really great podcast, if I do say so myself. And Serial Streamers is a true crime TV club that I started over a year ago. And it's basically a place where people who, like me, are into all these true crime documentaries and they're watching them, but they don't really have like a partner or a best friend who's into true crime. And so they want to talk about these documentaries. So they turn to Serial Streamers, and that's who we are. We are a virtual true crime TV club, and we meet in my Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok comments a couple times a month, anytime I release a Serial Streamers episode. And we go and just, talk about all these crazy true crime docs that we're watching together. So if you want to join us in the Serial Streamers True Crime TV Club, all you have to do is follow me on social media. I'm at Jami on Air. That's Jami on Air on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And just wait for me to post about the latest documentary that we're watching together. Then just hit me up in the comments and let me know your thoughts and theories about that documentary. And anytime I do watch a documentary for the Serial Streamers TV Club, I will release a podcast episode about it. And that episode will live on Murderish, the podcast. So you want to go and follow that podcast. And I will also release a video version on my YouTube channel, which is at Jami on Air. All right, enough gabbing. Let's get started. This documentary that we are covering today is a real doozy. This is a case that, if you don't know about this case, you've been living under a rock. And the documentary that I watched is The Menendez Brothers on Netflix. It's a 2024 documentary. It just came out. And the Menendez case is infamous. Like I said, you're living under a rock if you don't know about it. The whole thing went down in 1989. And that's when I was about 11 years old. I remember all of it, and I'll get into kind of my thoughts around that time. But before we get started on this recap of the Menendez Brothers documentary, just want to offer a couple trigger warnings. There are some very heavy topics that are discussed in this documentary, including suicide, sexual abuse, specifically child sex abuse. So if those are topics that are sensitive for you, then maybe, take care before watching or listening. All right. So let's talk about the Menendez family before we get into this recap. The Menendez family consists of Jose and Kitty Menendez. Those are the parents. Jose was 45 years old and Kitty was 47 years old at the time they were killed by their children, who were Lyle and Erik Menendez. Lyle was 21 years old when all of this unfolded, and his younger brother Erik was 18. And the Menendez family were a very wealthy family. They lived in Beverly Hills in a mansion on 722 North Elm Drive. You could live across the country from the United States and the city of Beverly Hills. It's iconic. Very ritzy, very wealthy, just money, money, money. Now, Jose Menendez was a very powerful mogul. He was the EVP chairman of Corolico Pictures. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. And I also don't have my glasses on. I'm looking at my iPad. Carocolo Pictures, Inc. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it. But more famously, he was also the EVP of RCA Records back in the day. He also was a head honcho over at Hertz, the rental car company. Jose was known to be the person who actually hired O.J. Simpson, who was a very famous football star back in the day, to star in a lot of Hertz commercials. So Jose was a very powerful mogul, made a lot of money, multi-millions. The family was estimated to be worth about $14 million at the time that Jose and Kitty were killed. And Kitty was a stay-at-home mom, although you get the sense that that's not really what she wanted out of life. She was a stay-at-home mom and probably on the outside looking in sort of looked like this, just very loving, doting mother who took care of her kids and kind of held the family together. But it would come out later, according to Lyle and Erik, her sons, that she really wanted to be in theater. She really wanted to be in radio. I don't think she aspired to be a stay-at-home mom, but that's really kind of the way that it needed to be. You get the sense that Jose demanded that he sort of be the center of their family, that the husband and the father was going to be the center of the family. The mother was going to stay home with the kids, and the kids were going to go to prestigious schools and, just basically have all the appearances of a perfect family. And by all accounts, they did. So you have Jose, who's this mogul, multimillionaire, very high-powered businessman. You have Kitty, who's a stay-at-home mom. You have Lyle, who had previously attended Princeton University, although we would later find out that he was actually suspended for plagiarism. And then you have Erik, who's this sort of rising tennis star, Erik being the younger brother. And so you have this picturesque, wealthy family in Beverly Hills. And by all accounts, from the outside looking in, they looked damn near perfect. But what people didn't know at the time is this was all a mirage. This was not at all who the Menendez family actually were. Because as we would come to find out, there were horrors going on inside that mansion. But we wouldn't find that out until Jose and Kitty Menendez were gunned down. And that's kind of where this whole story starts. So it was a Sunday evening, August 20th, 1989. Lyle, the oldest brother, 21 at the time, he calls 911 and he's crying. He says, "Someone shot our dad." And basically saying, he doesn't know what happened, but somebody shot their dad. But basically somebody had shot both of their parents, and they allegedly had come home to find their parents in this way. And the brothers ended up telling, the public and detectives that they just came home from a movie and they found their parents gunned down inside their home. And during an interview, I wouldn't even call it an interrogation, because really the police were not even looking at the Menendez brothers as suspects at the time. They really believed that they had come home from a movie and just found their parents this way. So, but of course the boys were, and I'm going to call them the boys. I know everybody does this. They are grown men, but they were children when this story really started, when the abuse and everything started. So a lot of times I'm going to call them the boys, and I still saw them as boys when they were going through trial. So if I say that, please forgive me. They are not boys. They are grown men. And they were technically grown men when they killed their parents, but I can't help for many reasons, but to view them as boys. And we'll get into that. But Erik, during this initial police interview, he tells the detectives, "I saw a lot of smoke in the room." He says later in a prison recorded phone call that was played on the documentary, Erik's like, "It's pretty incredible that we weren't arrested right then and there," because for him to say we saw a lot of smoke is basically admitting we were there right after the guns went off, because the smoke is going to clear at some point. So how would they know there was smoke in the room unless they're the ones who actually fired the shots from these shotguns? And I found this pretty jarring, especially back in the day in 1989. Like I said, I was like 11 years old, that the Menendez brothers stayed living in this house after finding their parents, bloodied and gunned down, in the home. And it's just pretty incredible that they stayed there, but who knows what their reasoning was behind that. Maybe they didn't really understand how to go rent an apartment. I'm not sure. But they did stay living in that house after they gunned down their parents. Fast forward to today, or at least to 2023, Lyle Menendez, 55 years old, and Erik Menendez, 51 years old, are incarcerated at R.J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego. It didn't start out that way because when all this went down, they were separated for a very, very, very long time. They weren't reunited at the same prison until about 21 years after all of this went down, but we'll get into that as well. Now, the documentary goes back to, 1988, and this is when the Menendez family moves from Calabasas, California to Beverly Hills. These are two ritzy neighborhoods. And that's because the brothers had been caught burglarizing the expensive homes of their friends. Basically, they knew their friends' parents had money, and they would go into their homes and steal cash, jewelry, all these things, and they got caught. And this was extremely embarrassing for Jose and Kitty Menendez, who by all accounts are really trying to keep up with that perfect family image. So they got to get out of Dodge, right? They don't want to live in Calabasas anymore because they've got this stink on them from these, their kids burglarizing these homes. So they pick up and they move to Beverly Hills, and that's in 1988 or thereabouts. Now, in the documentary, the most hated woman in America, I'm going to call her. Now, I know there are other women who are much more hated than her, but man, she's definitely a contender. And that is the original prosecutor in the Menendez brothers' first trial. And her name is Pamela Bosanich. I remember her back in the day because their first trial was televised, and I remember her having this very wholesome look, and she kind of looked really young, but she's featured in this documentary, and she had a lot to say, and a lot of her clips are going viral on TikTok, and pretty much everybody freaking hates this woman. And that's because she just says a lot of weird shit, which I'm going to get into. But specifically in the beginning of the documentary, she describes how detectives arrive at this crime scene and they see, Jose and Kitty Menendez, who'd been watching TV at the time. Jose was sitting on the couch. I believe Kitty Menendez was maybe sitting on the couch next to him, but then was on the floor by the time she had been, killed. And there's blood everywhere. And pardon me being very graphic, but it was a very graphic crime scene because they were killed with several shots at close range from a shotgun. And so Pamela Bosanich, the prosecutor in their first trial, says something like, yeah, when the detectives were there, Jose Menendez's brain fell out of his head while they were there. Like, that's how much of a slaughter this was. I don't know why she needed to say that on this documentary, but I think that her motivation was just to show how savage this crime was. Robert Rand, now he is a journalist and author. He has since written, more than one book on the Menendez brothers and their trial and this case. And he has been a supporter of theirs for many, many years, probably almost from the beginning. And he interviews the brothers way back when, right after these killings happened. And nobody knew who did it because, let's be clear, detectives, when they arrived at the house, they were not looking at the brothers as suspects. The brothers said they didn't do it, and pretty much everybody believed them. And so they're thinking like there's this savage killer out on the loose, and there's these poor boys who are left without their parents. So Robert Rand talks to at least one of the boys, I think it was Lyle, after this happened. And Lyle is just at first singing his father's praises. My dad, he's the best thing ever. I'm making these words up, but he's this, he's that. And just essentially how it's described now after, all the abuse evidence came out is that this was just Lyle continuing to try to preserve his family's legacy, because I believe, according to the boys, it's been ingrained in them for many, many years growing up to preserve the family legacy, to hide all of their secrets, to appear perfect, to just preserve that family legacy. And it's pretty shocking that even after we find out that Lyle and Erik killed their parents, they're still trying to keep up that facade and still trying to carry out their father's wishes of, you've got to preserve my legacy. And he did just that. So, and Robert Rand is, thinking, oh gosh, his parents must have been the greatest people ever, I'm sure, because that's what Lyle's saying. But really, in reality, he's just trying to preserve a legacy and he's hiding secrets. And in a recorded prison call that was played in the documentary, there are several of them where you get to hear Lyle and Erik speak from prison. One of the brothers, I think it was Lyle, says something like, I was quite lost not having my father to direct my life at that point. So, he kills his father, but then he's lost not having his overbearing father to direct every aspect of his life. It's like he was walking around like a zombie, like, what do I do? Now, after the parents are found gunned down in their mansion in Beverly Hills, and nobody knows it was the brothers that did it at first for the first few months, the brothers start saying they believe it was a mafia hit. Now, their father's this very powerful man. He's from Havana, Cuba. Who knows? But somehow he may have mafia ties, or the mafia was after him, and maybe it was a mafia hit. And the media kind of runs with this and starts saying that in their news stories, and people start to maybe believe, like, yeah, maybe this was a mafia hit. This is a very powerful guy. Then the brothers start spending a lot of money after their parents are found dead. They go on major shopping sprees. They buy a Porsche. They buy a Jeep, they buy clothes, they buy Rolexes, they buy floor seat tickets to, I think it was the Chicago Bulls basketball game. And you can see them in the background in one of the games. It's pretty bizarre in footage that's been played since then. They even bought a restaurant. So they start spending this money, and it was those shopping sprees that really got detectives going, wonder if these boys may have had something to do with their parents' murder. Maybe this was a motive. Maybe them getting access to the money was a motive for them to kill their parents. And that's kind of what gets detectives going, okay, maybe these are our suspects. And, in the media, this starts painting these boys in a bad light. It's like, you just walked in and found your parents gunned down, maybe by the mafia, who knows what, in this gruesome crime scene. And then as soon as they die, you just go and spend all their money. The optics of it did not look good. And Erik says from a prison call played in the documentary, the idea that I was having a good time is just absurd. And I understand where he's coming from. I understand that back then the optics appeared to be that these boys are like, yeah, woohoo, our parents are dead. Let's spend all their money. Let's have a great time. We're living our best lives. But when you know really what was actually going on, it was all a front. And yes, these boys spent their parents' money, but in my opinion, it was just, they weren't happy during that time. And Lyle admits that, hey, during that time, I was sobbing myself to sleep at night. I was hardly sleeping at all. I wasn't eating right. Like, I was really going through it during that time after my parents were killed. So eventually detectives are able to connect the Menendez brothers to gun purchases made in San Diego. And that is the link that they need to take this case to the prosecutor to get them charged and to go through trial. But that is actually not what broke this case wide open. And we're going to get to that. It's a very bizarre manner in which this case was broken wide open, and really how the Menendez brothers were actually linked to the killings. So we'll get to that in a minute. In March of 1990, Lyle Menendez is arrested while his brother Erik is on an international flight. And Lyle says at that point, that was a huge weight lifted off my shoulders, because they're carrying this burden, this huge secret of they are actually the ones who killed their parents. So he's arrested, Erik's on a flight, and eventually Erik is going to be arrested as well. And basically the motive is revealed to be, the parents' $14 million estate that the boys would be the sole inheritance of. So that's now the media blitz, let the media circus begin. Now the media is running with, oh my gosh, these boys have been hiding this all along. They're these rich, spoiled brats from Beverly Hills, and they gunned down their own parents just to get the $14 million inheritance. And this case blew up nationally. Everybody was talking about it. And like I said, I was about 11 years old when all this went down. And I remember totally buying in to whatever the media was spitting out. Now, I was 11 years old, so I just thought that like whenever the media says something, it's got to be true. In my innocence, that's what I thought. But I believed it. It's like, oh my God, they look like these spoiled rich kids from Beverly Hills, and they're just murdering their parents for money. Like, how savage can you be? But again, the optics didn't look good, but nobody knew what was actually going on in their lives from a very young age to the present. The brothers plead not guilty, and the family on both sides, on Kitty's side and on Jose Menendez's side, they believe the brothers. And the brothers are lying to everybody and still saying, even after they're arrested, they're like, this is all a misunderstanding. We had nothing to do with this. They just want to keep the lie going. And everybody believed them. Well, the family believed them. And Lyle specifically, the older brother, did not want to tell anyone about what was actually going on inside their home. He didn't even want to tell their attorneys. And he basically, it would destroy their father's reputation. And he was very much dead set against that, even though we found out later, he's the one who actively, he killed his parents along with his brother. But here he is trying to preserve his father's legacy and reputation. And during that time, Erik, the little brother particularly, was just a wreck. This crime was eating him alive. Now, back to the 1988 burglaries that the brothers got caught for. At that time, they were referred to Dr. Oziel, specifically Erik, the younger brother. And Dr. Oziel was some sort of therapist. Maybe he was a psychologist. I'm not sure, but some sort of therapist or counselor, something. Well, he's a doctor, so there's that. But he was referred to Dr. Oziel. And I think that's kind of like what happens when rich kids get into trouble. I believe it seems like, instead of actually being punished in an adequate way, you just get sent to go see a therapist when you're rich. And that's what happened with the Menendez brothers. So Erik goes to see Dr. Oziel, and basically he ends up, because this lie of, they're the ones who actually killed their parents, it's eating him alive. And eventually he confesses to Dr. Oziel and he says, we did it. Basically, like, me and my brother killed our parents. So what happens after that is pretty bizarre. Dr. Oziel, instead of trying to help the brothers through that or take the necessary steps to sort of like report that to the proper authorities, I'm not sure what the protocol is, or to help the brothers through this, Dr. Oziel decides he's going to start recording the brothers. And he convinces Erik to bring Lyle into sessions, which Lyle did not want to go. And he gets them both to talk about these killings, and he starts recording them. Now, also in the documentary, they talk about, Lyle talks about the fact that prior to them going to sessions with Dr. Oziel, their father, Jose, had forced Dr. Oziel to sign some sort of document that he would go and tell Jose every single thing that those boys said during their therapy sessions, which is highly unethical and highly unprofessional and not okay. So if that is true, then Dr. Oziel is a POS and he should have his license revoked, which I think he may have subsequent to all this, but that's a story for another day. And so Lyle's like, this guy's a quack. He broke professional code and he really is not to be trusted. But going back to Dr. Oziel taping the boys' sessions after they confess, or after Erik confesses, apparently Dr. Oziel, the dumbass that he is, he goes and tells not only his wife about the confession from the boys, he tells his mistress. So yeah, he had a patient, apparently. I'm going to say allegedly because I actually don't know this full story, but allegedly he had a patient named Judalon Smith, and she's this attractive woman who turns from patient into having an unethical relationship with Dr. Oziel. He's cheating on his wife, allegedly, with Judalon Smith. And so Dr. Oziel not only tells his wife about the boys' confession, but he also tells his mistress. Apparently, according to Judalon, Dr. Oziel asks her to eavesdrop on one of his sessions with the brothers so that she can actually hear with her own ears them confessing to these murders. And Judalon says she did just that. Well, at some point, according to Judalon, her relationship with Dr. Oziel turns bad. And she goes to police, and not only does she tell police about the Menendez brothers confessing to Dr. Oziel about killing their parents, she also makes claims, very serious claims against Dr. Oziel, that he sexually assaulted her, held her against her will, I believe, and manipulated her and all these things. Now, fast forward a little bit to the summer of 1990, and the brothers are incarcerated awaiting trial. And in 1990, Lyle, the older brother, writes a letter to Erik in jail. Erik receives the letter. And this letter, essentially, he's telling his younger brother, we should not tell anybody about the abuse. We should not let this out. We've got to preserve our father's legacy. These are not his exact words in the letter, but essentially he's saying, let's not talk about the abuse, not even to our attorneys. Let's keep it a secret. And in that letter, Lyle writes to Erik, he says something like, coming out with the abuse that our parents inflicted on us would be like killing our parents all over again. And so essentially in this letter from Lyle to Erik, this is essentially a confession, because the words killing our parents all over again insinuates that they were the ones who killed their parents. So at the end of the letter, Erik writes, that Lyle writes to Erik, he says something like, please destroy this letter after you read it. But Erik doesn't destroy the letter. He keeps it. And later it's found in his jail cell. And that is when all of, basically the brothers are like, well, shit. Now that this letter's been found, they know we killed our parents and they know about the abuse. We need to come clean with everything. And that's what they do. They basically come out to their attorneys, let their attorneys know, yes, the abuse happened. Here's what happened. Yes, we killed our parents, and it was because of the abuse. We were afraid for our lives. And the Menendez trial that was about to take place was essentially the very first high-profile murder trial that's going to be televised. And this is really what put court TV on the map as it kind of established court TV as a major network, whereas previous to this trial, they were kind of an unknown. And so this was pretty interesting that it was going to be televised and for the world to see something this high profile. Now, Erik Menendez, the younger brother, he ends up hiring Leslie Abramson as his defense attorney. Now, this was a really good move, and he says he got lucky finding her, but she was really well known as essentially a kick-ass defense attorney. She'd worked on some high-profile cases in the past, like Phil Spector. She'd represented him for a time. And so she was very well known, and she was a very sort of like no-holds-barred defense attorney. She just really went to bat for her clients, and she did for Erik Menendez. And then they flash to good old bitchy McBitcherson, Pamela Bozanich. Pamela Bozabitch. They cut to her, and she's the original prosecutor in the Menendez brothers' first trial. So now you see she is basically up against Leslie Abramson, who is a kick-ass defense attorney, and anybody would tell you that. And so, Pamela Bozanich seems a little bitter that she essentially lost the first trial. Now, she didn't actually lose. It did, spoiler alert, it did end up in a hung jury, a mistrial. That, to me, is more of a loss for the prosecution than it is for the defense. In fact, it's sort of a little bit of a win for the defense, in my opinion. So Pamela Bozabitch, she seems really bitter after all these years. And so they flash back to her in this documentary. And she says, if I said what I really thought about Leslie Abramson, I'd be sued. She says, yeah, and I think she's lost all her money. So, yeah. And she's basically just trying to be like passive aggressive. Like, yeah, that bitch lost all her money. So I win. It's giving bitter. It's giving really, really, really bitter. It's giving I lost and I'm still bitter about it. And Bozanich is really sympathetic toward Kitty Menendez, because she says in the documentary, that poor woman who was treated like a doormat by her husband and kids. And so basically you find out pretty quickly that this prosecutor from the first trial, Bozanich, she is not a fan of Jose Menendez. She admits that nobody liked the guy. And she's not a fan of Lyle and Erik Menendez. Oh, but she thinks that Kitty's just innocent in all of this. And, they treated her like a doormat, and that poor woman. Well, it's like, my first thought was like, bitch, the evidence. The evidence against Kitty Menendez, and it ain't pretty. It ain't pretty, because if you go back and listen and watch the first trial, and certainly she knows more about this case than anybody, and for her to be sympathetic toward Kitty Menendez is just wild to me, because it would come out at trial that Kitty, she was not a loving, doting mother. In fact, there were reports that she didn't really care for her children, didn't help them when they outcried about the abuse, when she saw things, when she heard things. Lyle and Erik actually say that Kitty Menendez participated in the abuse. Now, I don't know if that evidence came out at trial, so I'm going to say she allegedly participated in the abuse, but I think we know enough as far as, all the information that's come out about this case, that Kitty Menendez was not a loving mother. She was not a good mother. And this is even like her own sister is on Lyle and Erik's side with this. And, and the cousin is even talking about how one of the Lyle and Erik's cousin, she went to Kitty at one point and told her that one of the brothers had admitted that the father had been abusing him. And she went to Kitty, and Kitty basically was like, I don't believe you, grabbed the brother by the arm, just marched him upstairs and was like, whatever, did nothing about it. So when you are a parent who stands by and you know that your children are being abused, whether she participated or not, I'm going to hold judgment for that. I do have thoughts on that, but she certainly knew about it. And she certainly did things and said things that were not okay as a mother. So for Bozanich to be like, oh, this poor woman, get out of here. And the defense, very much in contrast to the prosecutor, it came out at trial that Kitty Menendez had threatened to poison her entire family, including her sons. She'd left suicide notes, and she basically just did nothing about the abuse, and or worse. Jill Lansing was the defense attorney that was hired by Lyle Menendez. Now, she was not high profile at all, to my knowledge, like Leslie Abramson was. Now, the brothers had their own defense attorneys, and I don't know the exact story as to why exactly Erik, the younger brother, ended up with this kick-ass defense attorney who would have cost a lot of money. And then Lyle ends up with Jill Lansing. Now, Jill Lansing, by all accounts, was a very formidable defense attorney, very capable, and she defended him, I think, as best she could. But she definitely was not, that flashy, high-profile defense attorney that Leslie Abramson was. She may have even been a public defender, but I'm not sure on that. And the Menendez trial came on the heels of the very highly publicized Rodney King trial, which we all know how that turned out. And there was an uproar and riots in Los Angeles. So this was a very heated time, and two very high-profile trials, Rodney King, Menendez Brothers, and we would find out too, then OJ is going to come after the Menendez brothers. So a lot going on in Los Angeles at this time. And the same judge, Stanley Weisberg, presided over the Rodney King trial as well as the Menendez brothers trial. Okay, so after Erik and Lyle basically come clean with their attorneys, and with everybody, that yes, we did kill our parents, but it's because of this very dark secret that we've been keeping. And that is that we have been being sexually abused since we were children by our father and by our mother. And so then the media catches wind of this, of course, the abuse, and they start calling it the abuse excuse. And a lot of people are not buying it, and they are mocking the Menendez brothers. Like, oh, of course, now that you're forced to level a defense against this brutal act you committed against your parents, of course you're going to say you were abused, right? And like a lot of people are kind of like side-eyeing and rolling their eyes and calling it the abuse excuse. Most people, I think, did not believe them. And then you have the clothing that the brothers were wearing to trial, and it has become infamous and iconic at this point. But they were wearing these like pale pink and pale blue knit sweaters with a, nicely ironed, white colored shirt underneath. And then everybody's calling that, everybody being the media and everybody on these late night talk shows and everything, calling it the sweater defense. Like basically like, again, rolling their eyes like, oh, these brutal murderers are going to come into this courtroom wearing these pale pink sweaters, and we're just going to think they're these innocent boys because they're dressing innocently. Well, we can see right through you. When a case is this high profile, everybody's going to nitpick every single aspect of it. And boy, their attire was definitely called to the carpet. And again, everybody's looking at these brothers as two spoiled, privileged, rich kids from Beverly Hills that did this heinous act for money. There's no sympathy for them. And also at that time in the early 90s, Jose Menendez, he's this business executive, this high-powered, high-profile business executive, lived in Beverly Hills. He did not fit the mold of somebody who would be abusing his sons, especially in that way. And we also didn't really quite understand sexual abuse against boys specifically. And it's really almost embarrassing to say, but we really just were not evolved on that subject at this time. So there were a lot of things going on contextually that you have to really take into consideration with this case. They talk about in the documentary that Jose Menendez was born in Havana, Cuba. His family was very prestigious. He was from a very prestigious bloodline, very wealthy family, but they lost everything during the revolution. And his whole family, including Jose, had to flee to America, and now they found themselves refugees in a new country. So they had nothing. But Jose just kind of what do they say? Pulled up his bootstraps or whatever and just really took life by the balls, and he created this wealth for himself and his family. He was a very driven person by all accounts. He kind of rises to the top, an executive, a high-powered executive at a lot of these big companies, RCA, Hertz Rental Company, and more. In the documentary, they say, I don't know if it was one of the brothers who said, somebody said that, people were either afraid of or pulled in by Jose Menendez. And Kitty Menendez was pulled in by Jose. He was a very feared person. A lot of people talked about how afraid they were of him, how he was a monster, how he was a bully, how nobody liked him. He just did not have a good reputation, but on the outside, he did look like he was part of the perfect family. But in reality, he was kind of a monster. Well, he was a monster. And Kitty was known to be this fiery, she had a fiery personality. She wanted to be in theater, in radio, but that just was not going to be in the cards for her because she married this man from Havana, Cuba, and this probably narcissistic, I hate to throw around that term, but, self-absorbed, all about me kind of guy. And he basically insisted that he's going to be the center of the family and everybody else is just going to be playing a side role to him, including Kitty. Now, after the brothers admit to their attorneys that they were abused and give them all the details, Leslie Abramson reaches out to a man named Dr. Vickery. Now, Dr. Vickery, again, is some sort of psych expert therapist. I'm not sure what his exact role is. Please forgive me. But by all accounts, he's a very well-respected, ethical psych expert of some sort, doctor of some sort, doctor of psychology, maybe. So after the brothers admit that they are the ones who killed their parents, Leslie Abramson reaches out to Dr. Vickery, and he's like a doctor of psychology. I don't know his exact title. She reaches out to him because she wants him to interview her client, Erik Menendez, because while she knows that the Menendez brothers killed their parents, she doesn't know why. And so she sends her client, Erik Menendez, to Dr. Vickery to try to find out what is going on here. So Dr. Vickery interviews Erik, and he says in the documentary, when I met with Erik, he was extremely depressed, so distraught, suicidal, just a wreck. He says that Erik just kept rambling on about his father, reiterating how wonderful his dad was and yada, 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 singing his praises. And Dr. Vickery sits up in his chair and he's like, if he's so wonderful, then why did you murder him? And that's the question. It's like he knew, that's the point at which he knew there is a lot more going on in this family than meets the eye than what these boys are claiming. There is something going on, and we've got to get to the bottom of this, because two brothers are not just going to pick up and get shotguns and fire rounds at several rounds at close range to their parents just because they want some money. Money that they're going to inherit inevitably anyway. Like, that doesn't make any sense. So he's like, there's something going on in this family, and he gets to the bottom of it. During trial, Diane Vandermolen, who is the cousin of Lyle and Erik Menendez, she testifies that she saw Jose do really dangerous things with the boys. For example, playing this game where he lets Lyle, get up on this kitchen countertop or some sort of countertop and then tells him to jump and that he'll catch him. And he catches him for the first few rounds. But then Lyle, as a toddler, just goes to jump to his father, and his father just backs off and lets him fall. And basically, it's a lesson for his son to never trust anyone. And I mean, that is just awful that a father could do that to a toddler who could break his neck or get a serious head injury. So that just sort of it gives you a lot of insight as to who Jose Menendez was as a father. And again, Diane testifies that Lyle told her that at some point while they were together one night that his father had been abusing him. And she goes and tells Kitty, but Kitty says, I don't believe you, grabs Lyle by the arm, rushes him upstairs, and it's never to be talked about again. Another man, I didn't catch his name, but he testifies during the first trial that he saw Jose hit 5-year-old Lyle hard. So the abuse, there was evidence for it. There were numerous people within the family and otherwise who testified that this abuse, several forms of abuse were going on inside that family. Jose Menendez's sister also testified at the first trial, and she says Jose was extremely aggressive toward those boys, even at a very young age. And basically, she said he made the boys extremely, like in an unhealthy way, very competitive against each other. And she hated that. And then it's the moment everybody had been anticipating. And that is when Lyle, the older brother, takes the stand in his own defense. And this testimony was absolutely brutal. I remember seeing it when I was a young child, 11, 12, 13 years old, whatever I was by then. And it was brutal and it was very believable, at least to me. Lyle testified that beginning at from age 6 to 8, he says that's when his father began abusing him sexually. And he admits on the stand that he also began abusing his younger brother, Erik. He says one day he took him out into the woods and did a lot of the things that his father had done to him, and he went and did that to his brother. Now, my first thought, now looking at it, is that why would he admit to that if it wasn't true? Like, they can still have the abuse claim, whether it's true or not, but why would he have to go into such damning and embarrassing detail that he also was an abuser of his brother? He didn't need to go that far. Now, certainly that's not proof that he's telling the truth, but to me, it definitely made me believe that, yeah, what he's saying is true. This is not something you'd want to admit openly. And, we are more aware of grooming and learned behavior nowadays. And in my mind, I can't say that I was upset with him for doing that to his brother. It's awful. And it certainly was damaging to his little brother. But that, in my opinion, is learned behavior. And that was learned from somebody else in the house, and that is his father. They didn't talk about this, I don't think, in the documentary, but we all know now that Lyle, for many years from a young age, had to wear a toupee on top of his head because he began losing his hair at a rapid pace at a very young age. I want to say in his teenage years. And he was also a bedwetter, I think, until about the age of 14. Those two things coupled together, or even one on its own, tells me that he'd been traumatized in some way and he was experiencing extreme forms of abuse, and that his loss of hair at such a young age and his bedwetting into his teenage years seems to me to be an indication that he was going through something very, very dark during those times. Now, during trial, the judge makes it clear that the defense cannot use abuse as an excuse for murder. So the defense essentially had to prove that the boys were afraid for their lives in that very moment that they committed these killings. So they killed their parents in self-defense. Now, that is sort of like a touchy defense because fortunately, unfortunately, however you want to look at it, the boy, a lot of times in these situations, when children are experiencing abuse, there isn't going to be that evidence of, aha, I caught you in the act. And that's number one. And number two, oftentimes it's sort of a buildup. When children respond to abuse by killing their abuser, it's not often that it happens, the first time and during the act. It's sort of over time, and the psychological effects. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that oftentimes somebody who is attacked by somebody and that they immediately respond and kill in self-defense, that's one thing. And the public would look at that as, yeah, of course, you were defending yourself. Like, we empathize with you. We're on your side. We believe you. But unfortunately for children and adults who are the victims of different forms of abuse over time, oftentimes this happens in secret. It happens in the shadows. It happens when nobody's around to see it. And so if and when those victims or survivors, however you want to look at it, go and kill their abuser, they don't get the same treatment as somebody who kills their abuser right in the moment the first time it happens. It's hard to explain, but it's just they don't get that same level of, hey, we believe you. And so the boys, the brothers, their defense had to prove not that like, hey, because of the abuse, you should let them off for murder. It was actually that the defense had to prove that they committed these killings because they absolutely believed that their lives were in danger at that very moment. And so they killed in self-defense. But that's what they call an imperfect self-defense, not a perfect self-defense. Perfect self-defense would be you're being abused or attacked, and in that moment, you turn around and you react by killing your attacker, abuser. Imperfect self-defense, it's basically that you're not in imminent danger in that moment. Like, you're not actually being attacked or abused in that moment, but you believe honestly that your life was in danger in that moment. But maybe other people from the outside looking in would say that's an unreasonable belief that you were in danger, but you yourself honestly believe that I am in danger in this very moment and I am going to kill the person who is trying to kill me, essentially. So it's an imperfect self-defense. And Erik then takes the stand, and he's the younger brother, and his testimony was also brutal to watch. He says that the abuse began at the age of 6 and it lasted for 12 years, meaning right up until he killed his parents at the age of 18. And Erik explains while he's on the witness stand that they decided they had to shoot their parents in that moment because leading up to the killings, he had finally gathered up the strength to tell his older brother Lyle that he was in fact actively being abused by their father. And the brother, Lyle, goes and confronts Jose, the father, and basically says, like, you are I don't know what he says, you're a sick bastard, you're a sick something. And he says to his father, I'm going to tell the family, I'm going to tell the police if you don't stop doing this. And that confrontation does not go well. And Jose kind of looks at him and says something like, according to Lyle, he says something like, this is my son and what I do with my son is none of your business. And basically from that point on, both of the brothers became paranoid and believed that now that they've let the father know that they don't want this abuse to happen and that Lyle has threatened to go to the police or the family with the abuse, to outcry about the abuse, they believed that their parents were going to kill them at that moment, basically to preserve their reputations. And rewinding a little bit, when Erik first took the stand, he said some things that were very shocking, at least at first when you hear them, but when you really sort of like digest it in a sick way, it sort of made sense. And so Erik was asked by his attorney, when the abuse first started, when you were very young, like 6 years old, did you want the abuse to stop? And Erik answers, no. And he says, and the attorney says, well, why? And he says, because that was the only time that I got to spend one-on-one time with my father. He was always gone and I coveted that time. And that during those moments when he was abusing me, he was nice and loving toward me. And whereas he could be a real monster outside of those instances. So he, as a young boy, that's how he processed it. Like, he didn't know that it probably was wrong at the time and he didn't know that it shouldn't be happening. But all he knew was this was my one-on-one time with my father, which I really wanted. And he was also really nice and loving toward me during that time. And again, my mind goes toward, I absolutely believe Erik when he says that, because why admit in front of the whole world that when the abuse first happened, you didn't want it to stop. It's a really sick, concept, but it's also like, this is a young boy that he doesn't know what to think, but all he knows is that he thinks this is sort of like bonding time with his father, as sad and sick as that may sound. And Erik says on the witness stand that my father told me he would kill me if I told anyone. So again, it's been ingrained into them from a very young age for years and years of this abuse that's gone on, that you will die if you tell anybody. So they were really groomed and trained. It was ingrained in them to never, never, never let these secrets out, or there could be consequences, deadly consequences. Everything starts coming to a head about a week before the killings. And during that time, Erik had just graduated high school. He really wanted to go to Stanford for college. And because mainly he would escape his father, he would be on the other side of the country and he could just get away from the abuse that was actively happening at that time. But he says in the documentary, my father refused to let me go. And this was crushing to Erik, because that was the moment in which he realized, I'm stuck. Like, I'm going to be in this forever with my father and I cannot escape him. That is when Erik hesitantly goes to his big brother Lyle and admits to the abuse, because he's just desperate. Like, what am I going to do? Who can help me solve this problem? I've got to get away from my father. And then that's when Lyle goes and confronts Jose. It doesn't go well. And then they start fearing for their lives. This is the time at which the brothers say they decided we need to get protection. And that's when they go buy the shotguns at the San Diego gun shop. Then on the night of the killings, there was some sort of confrontation in the house, according to the brothers. Things got heated and Lyle panics. And he runs upstairs. He tells his brother, this is it. Like, this is it. Our parents are going to kill us right now. Our parents are going to kill us right now. We've got to protect ourselves. Get the guns. And so they admit they go get the shotguns, they load them, and they go downstairs and they essentially say, we killed our parents before they were going to kill us. The brothers admit that they decided they needed to go to the movie theater right after killing their parents so that they could sort of set up an alibi. So they go and get movie tickets so that they could show later, like, hey, we went to this movie. We weren't home at the time of the killings. They go and they hide the guns, and then they go back to the house. And that's when Lyle calls 911 from an upstairs bedroom. Going back to the imperfect self-defense, I want to explain this a little more clearly. So there's a perfect defense, there's an imperfect defense. Imperfect defense basically says that you're not really in imminent danger. However, you believe honestly that you are in imminent danger right at that very moment, even though others looking at the situation through a different lens would say, well, that's an unreasonable belief. But the person in the scenario is like, no, I honestly believed at that time I was in imminent danger, even though nobody was actually actively attacking me in that moment. So the first trial ends in December of 1993, and the trial went on from July to December of 93. So it was a long trial. The jury is deadlocked. There is a mistrial declared. And essentially, there were some jurors from the first trial that were interviewed in this documentary, and they basically say it was split 50-50 between the men and the women. The men hands down wanted to convict on first-degree murder. They didn't quite understand, sex abuse against boys, but the women really were sympathetic toward the boys and tended to believe the brothers that they were abused. And so that is how they ended in a mistrial. It was sort of like a battle of the sexes. From prison, Erik says that the prosecutor, Bozanich, or whatever her name is, Pamela Bozanich, I think, kept saying during the trial, well, the boys could have just left. They could have just gotten up and left. But Erik says, but we were groomed to know that we could never escape. And now understanding a lot better how grooming and coercive control works, it is easy for me to believe that they believed there was no escape. You couldn't just walk out that door and go, okay, bye, I'm not being abused anymore. I'm going to get out of here. I'm an adult. The psychological effects of coercive control and grooming over that many years are very real. And in my opinion, Bozanich is applying simple logic to an extremely complicated subject. It's not as easy as just leaving. So for her to say that is just really misguided. Gil Garcetti, who was the district attorney in Los Angeles at the time the trial ended, he vows that they're going to retry the case and the death penalty will be on the table once again. 5 months later, June 1994, this is when O.J. Simpson is arrested, and the media sort of just forgets all about the Menendez brothers. It's like, okay, now we're on to OJ, and that was the trial of the century. And the Menendez brothers talk about how they threw around the football in their backyard with OJ Simpson back in the day when their father, Jose, had hired him to star in commercials for Hertz rental car. Norma Novelli, she was a woman who was Lyle's confidant while he was incarcerated. But she ends up turning from a confidant to recording conversations unbeknownst to him that she was having with him for over 2.5 years. And all I could think of is, bitch, really? Like, bitch. She's this confidant. And then for her own reasons, she starts taping, her phone calls with him. And it's like, what do you stand to gain? I think she was about to write a book or did write a book at the time. And it's like, I just think it's such gross behavior. And the theory as to why she kind of flipped on Lyle was that she had a crush on him, and she was this kind of like much older woman. And a lot of it kind of gave people the ick back then that it seemed like she may have had a crush or some love interest in this younger guy, Lyle Menendez. And when that didn't work out for her, she kind of switched on him because she was bitter. And so she goes and she takes these 2.5 years of audio recordings and she makes them public. That's one theory. And in the documentary, there was a lot of talk as far as those tapes being made public, having a lot of bearing on the Menendez brothers' second trial, and maybe being the reason why Lyle did not take the stand in the second trial, which was a big contrast to the first trial. But Lyle says in the documentary, he says, in reality, those tapes had no bearing on the second trial. He says that those audio tapes were withheld from the second trial because apparently Lyle had made disparaging comments on those tapes about the judge in the trial being biased. So I don't know what the actual truth is. Other people say that those tapes being made public did have a bearing on the second trial because they say that Lyle made some comments about being willing to lie on the stand in the second trial and sort of alluding to the fact that he's a good liar or that he could do that no problem. So I don't know where the truth lies. There's so much information in this case, but I actually do want to answer that question for myself as to why Lyle decided not to take the stand in the second trial. But, there were different theories as to why he didn't take the stand and whether those tapes from his former confidant being made public had anything to do with that decision. October of 1995, OJ is acquitted in Los Angeles. Now, this is a big stain on the reputation of the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. Like, that was a huge loss for them. So the theory is that the judge in the second Menendez trial, which is also happening and being tried by the LA District Attorney's Office, now they're like determined to get a conviction, right? They're like, we're going to burn these kids. This is the theory, that we are going to do whatever it takes to get a conviction of the Menendez brothers because we didn't win in the Rodney King trial. We also didn't win in the OJ trial. We are going to get a win in the second Menendez trial. That was sort of the talk at the time and even now. In the second trial, there were some major differences from the first trial. Number one, Lyle Menendez does not take the stand. And that is a huge blow because then a lot of the abuse claims cannot come into trial. And also Lyle Menendez was very believable to a lot of people, including the women on the jury of his first trial. So if he's not going to testify in the second trial, that's a big blow to the defense. Number two, the second one was not going to be televised. And whether that made a difference or not, I don't know. But essentially, the judge in the second trial threw out much of the abuse evidence, disallowed it from coming into trial. And that really crippled the defense's case because it really hinged. Their self-defense claim, their imperfect self-defense claim came because they were abused. And if a lot of that evidence is not allowed to come in, for example, the cousin who testified that Lyle admitted to her that he was being abused, if that cannot come in, the defense is really crippled. Another big difference between the first and second trial was that the jury in the second trial now only had two options. They either had guilty of first-degree murder or acquit. There was no in between. There was no manslaughter, which would kind of be an in between. They did not have that option. So knowing that the brothers admitted to killing their parents, well, what are you going to do with that? You're not going to acquit. I mean, basically the talk is that you're not going to acquit. You know they did something. They killed their parents. So you either have first degree murder or acquit. And in that scenario, the jury, some of them just felt like, well, our hands were tied. We had to find them guilty of something. And if the only choice was first degree murder, then so be it. And that is exactly what happened. The second trial ended in, guilty of first degree murder. Although the jury did have some sympathy toward them and spared their lives, and they did not inflict the death penalty. They basically said, you get life without parole. After the brothers were found guilty, they had thought, they'd assumed that they would serve their time in prison together, but that was not the case. Much to their disappointment, they were separated for many, many years. And I find that so sad because they both are like, this may very well be the last time that I see my brother being escorted to a different van that's going to take him to a different prison than the one that I'm going to. And that's it. I don't know if I'll ever see him again. And that's what they thought. Now, the brothers did appeal to federal courts. Their appeals were denied. And essentially that's when they, submitted to the fact that we're never getting out. We're never going to see each other again. But 21 years later, Erik is then transferred to the prison that Lyle was serving his time in San Diego, and they were reunited after 21 years of being separated. So as of the current date, the brothers are serving their time together in San Diego. And basically in the aftermath of everything, Lyle ended up getting his sociology degree in prison. Erik starts creating really beautiful artwork. He's a very talented painter. And in fact, he kept in touch with one of the female jurors in his first trial, and he sent her a painting, and she still has it to this day. And public awareness subsequent to this whole Menendez trial taking place and all the story coming out, public awareness about men specifically being sexually abused really helped the brothers to be reunited, because then the public kind of shifted their mindset in that it's like before it was really hard for people to believe that boys could be abused in that way. But the public really shifted their mindset on that. And a lot of people now are like, oh, of course, this happens. This happens all the time, unfortunately. And Oprah actually did a show kind of lifting the veil on sex abuse of boys. And that really kind of helped the plight of the Menendez brothers, who've claimed all these years that they were abused by their father. And a lot of people having many years of people not believing them and the public not being on their side, it sort of started to shift. And that Oprah show where she had the whole audience was filled with male survivors of sexual abuse, that really kind of shifted the narrative, and people started to have empathy for the brothers and start to believe their claims of abuse. And Lyle has since devoted his life in prison to helping sex abuse survivors. Now, in the fall of 2020, TikTok enters the chat, and that is sort of when the Menendez story sort of gets a revival on TikTok, and all these millennials are educating themselves on the trial and the case, and they're now believing the brothers, and they're talking about it on TikTok, and it's going viral, and it's really helping to shift the narrative to many people across the world, believing the Menendez brothers and believing maybe they ought to be out of prison by now. And a lot of people are asking the question, myself included, if the Menendez brothers were tried for their parents' murders today, what would the outcome be? Because I have to believe, given all of our better understanding of child sex abuse, I really think that things would be a lot different. I think there would be a good chance they would not be convicted of first degree murder. It would be some lesser charge, and that they would not have been sentenced to life in prison without parole and separated in all these, inhumane acts. At one point, this prosecutor Banazabitch, or whatever the hell her name is, she says something like, and this Free the Menendez movement on TikTok, like she's rolling her eyes at people on TikTok really carrying the torch for the Menendez brothers. And she calls them the Menendez. And she basically says in the documentary, she says, why don't we just take a poll and, talking about these TikTokers. She's like, why don't we just take a poll and let these guys out? And she's like, I got news for you. Your opinions aren't facts. And she says, by the way, all you TikTokers, I got guns all over the house, so don't you mess with me. It's like, did you just threaten TikTok? Like, did you just threaten everybody on TikTok? I don't want to say crazy, but she's a whack job, in my opinion. The lady is giving bitter with a capital B in this documentary. I cannot believe that she even agreed to come on this documentary, because now she ain't coming off well. And first off, I'm thinking, you're a fucking weirdo. Second of all, I'm thinking, let's talk facts. You saw the evidence that came out in this trial. Don't discount these TikTokers. A lot of them have done their research and they have looked into the evidence, which was displayed for the world to see in their first trial. So they are educated on this case and they are talking about facts. And they're not just going, the Menendez brothers are cute, let's let them out. No, they're talking about the facts of the case may very well warrant them getting a resentencing and letting these guys out of prison. This lady is just insufferable. In 2023, the Menendez brothers file a habeas petition to vacate their murder convictions based on brand new evidence that has come to light. And it's two pieces of evidence. Number one, Roy Rosello. He is a former member of the Puerto Rican boy band that was a huge hit, I think in the 1980s. He came out in a 2023 documentary and he claims that Jose Menendez also abused him. And I believe Roy, and many people believe Roy. And his outcry against Jose Menendez is now being used in their habeas petition for the Menendez brothers to either have their murder convictions vacated or maybe get a resentencing. The second piece of evidence that came out is an old letter that Erik wrote to his cousin, who I believe is now deceased, but wrote to his cousin, essentially admitting in that letter years ago, way before the parents were killed, that his father had been abusing them. He sort of wrote it in a roundabout way. He didn't come out in the letter and say, my father did this to me. But you can read between the lines that he's essentially admitting that they are being abused by their father in this letter. So with this letter that was found, as well as the outcry of Roy Rosello against Jose Menendez, those two pieces of evidence are being used to try and vacate the murder convictions of the Menendez brothers. And we will see how that goes. In October of 2024, just this month, the Los Angeles County DA, George Gascon, announced that he's reviewing this habeas petition and he's going to make a decision regarding whether this new evidence warrants a resentencing or even a retrial of the Menendez brothers. So we will see how this plays out. My thoughts on this entire thing are that back in the day when I was a kid, I believed what the media was saying. I believed the prosecutor that these are just two savage rich boys that wanted the money and they killed their parents for it. Now, years ago, when I started working in the true crime space as a true crime podcaster, I started to shift. And I firmly believed, based on the evidence, I started rewatching the trial and looking into the facts of their first trial and their second trial, but mostly their first trial because it was televised. And I started believing the brothers years ago, and I have spoken out about it on my social media. I firmly believe today that they were abused from a young age. I believe the father and the mother were culpable in it. I don't believe that is an excuse for murder. But I do believe that some leniency should be placed, some credence, heavy credence should be given to the fact that these boys were psychologically, sexually, physically abused all their lives, essentially. And that resulted in their parents' deaths. And that is the reason for it. I do believe the imperfect self-defense claim. And I'm not saying they should never have done prison time. I'm saying they should have done prison time for what they did. But I think that they've done enough, and I would like to see them get out of prison at this point. I don't think they're a danger to society. Now, again, I haven't interviewed them. I don't know them. I don't know I'm not their counselor, but just my gut tells me that it's time. It's time. They've served enough time for what happened to them. I empathize with their situation. I have so much sympathy for what they endured, and I wholeheartedly believe all of it. And that's based on not just them, their testimony. I believe them. As a juror, when you're picked as a juror in a trial, you really are supposed to go with your gut instinct, as well as like you have to obey certain laws and rules and things like that as a jury instructions, but you also have to go with your gut. Like, is this person believable or not? I found Lyle and Erik Menendez believable. Their family corroborates their claims. Roy Rosello, he comes off as believable to me. He's now corroborating their claims. You have this letter that also further corroborates. You have the account of the cousin saying that Lyle told her the father was doing this. I just think that all of it makes sense and they are to be believed. I wonder how everything would have played out for the Menendez brothers if the killings would have happened as they were being abused. Like in that moment, let's just say the father came into their bedroom, began abusing them, and one of them turned around and like killed him for that. I think that a lot of people would have had sympathy for them, but unfortunately for them, they didn't have that advantage. And I know that's probably the wrong word to use, but they killed while they were not in that moment being abused, but had been abused certainly leading up to that for years. So I just wonder how this would have played out for them if the killings would have happened spur of the moment while they were being abused in that moment. And as far as the scripted series that just came out, I have not watched it. There's been a lot of buzz about it. I think the cover art is highly problematic. I think that it paints these brothers as potentially being like lovers, as gross as that sounds. I think that's problematic. I think it's unnecessary. And I think it's insensitive to what these brothers went through as children through their teenage years. And I don't think that that was the right move on the cover art. And so I may or may not watch the scripted series. I'm more interested in factual information versus dramatized information on this case. And I also don't want to see the abuse played out in the scripted series. I'm not saying that they shouldn't have done that. It's not something I'm ready or want to see. Those are my thoughts on the scripted series. Haven't seen it. A lot of people have. A lot of controversy. Would love to know what you guys think. But I'm going to wrap this up here, and make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel so you don't miss any Serial Streamers recaps. I am at Jami on air. That's Jami. Also follow Murderish, the podcast. And my podcast Murderish is available wherever you get your podcasts. And that is where the audio version of these recaps will live. And just follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Everything is at Jami on air. And remember, cults are stupid, Ted Bundy's ugly, scammers suck at life, and binging true crime documentaries is self-care. Don't let anybody tell you different. See you next time.